Officiate Live? Is it red? Okay. Dallas Officiate Live last week. She's going to blame it on YouTube. I think we might have forgot to hit live. I can't find it. All right. Last week, if you weren't here, we have notes we can go back and give you if you need those. But we continued on. This is week 6. Does everybody have a piece of paper that needs one outline? We're in week 6 of I'm a Christian. And so for the first 5 weeks, we have been talking about redefining that word Christian to the rest of the world. Because for the last hundreds of years, we have redefined the word to mean absolutely nothing, right? So we've talked about taking back that word into where when we go out in the world and we claim to be a Christian, it should mean something. It should, people should be able to tell that we're different, that we are unlike the rest of the world. And because for years, for centuries literally, we have claimed to be a Christian and then reflected the rest of the world, look just like everybody else that we come in contact with. And so it means absolutely nothing to where it's ignored. And so we started to look at, if we wanted that word to mean something, what do we have to do? And the first thing we talked about was being a believer, being a true believer. And if you are a true believer in Jesus, then that's going to be visible in your life, because true belief results in action. So if you truly believe in something, there's going to be action. There's going to be visible evidence, not because you're striving to, right? Not because you have to act like a believer. If you truly believe in something, there's going to be action whether you are even thinking about it. It's just going to happen. There's going to be a natural reaction to what you believe in. And so we spent 2 weeks looking at what a true believer is. And last week I summed that up by just saying, if you truly believe, that results in you giving your life to Christ. You can't hear about Jesus, understand about Jesus, appreciate what Jesus did, and not give your life to Christ, right? It can't happen. If you truly believe in what the gospel says, then you're going to give your life to Him. And so then last week we started looking at, in order to be a Christian, to redefine that word, we need to be a church member. And again, it's not saying that in order to be saved or anything like that, we have to be a member of a church. But we talked about how Paul and even in Acts and in Revelation, John, they all pointed to the importance of each individual believer being plugged into a local congregation. And not just for us, it is for us. We talked about last week, that's where we get our motivation, that's where we get our hope, that's where we get encouragement, a reminder of hope. That's not where our hope comes from, but we're reminded of our hope in our congregations. And so it's important for us to get those things, but it's also important for other believers that you're a member of a church, right? Because we talked about being a body, and you are a member of that body. So 2 things we talking about when talking about being a church member. We talked about first, we need to be an attending church member. You need to be going to church, right? And these things are going to build off one another as we continue on tonight and cover a third thing that we need to be. Before we can do anything else, you have to be an attending church member. It does you no good to say you're a member of a church and you don't go to church. You're not contributing to anything if you're not there. If you're not in the congregation, if you're not walking through these doors, then you're not really contributing to the church, okay? And so then on top of that, if you're attending church member, well, now we need to start working on being a serving church member, right? We talked about how there's a lot of churches that are filled with people that do not serve in any capacity. They're just sitting there and they're wanting to be served, but they're not ready and willing to serve. Going back to the body and talking about a body, and we make up the body of Christ. That is the church. Every body has different members, and those members all have different functions and different responsibilities and different jobs. And so we talked about, if you're not doing your job, then you're just a useless part of the body that can be cut off, right? Every single one of you are called to do something. Nobody's called to do nothing. Nobody's called to come in and sit on a church pew or a church chair and just listen to preaching and listen to singing and then go home. Everybody is supposed to be contributing to the body, and if you're not contributing, somebody's having to do your job or it's not getting done. All right, so we're all called to attend. We need to be here. We need to be present, and we're all called to serve. All right, we're all called to do something. And that's not just for your benefit, it's for the benefit of others, right? People here rely on you, okay? Just like you rely on other people, all right? So tonight we're going to continue on with that, and we're going to talk about a big one, and we're going to cover one, and then next week we're going to cover the last two, and the week after that will be Bible school, so it's going to break down for us nicely. But tonight we're going to talk about how we need to be a unifying church member. Be a unifying church member. This first text here, 1 Corinthians 13:13, I put the tail end of the chapter on there, but you've probably never been to a wedding and not heard 1 Corinthians 13, right? Where it describes love. Love is patient, love is kind, and all this stuff. And so we read that chapter because it's a beautiful chapter to read, and Paul does such a great job of pinning out what love looks like. And then he sums it up at the end of the chapter in verse 13 by saying, so now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. And the reason it's so great to read at a wedding, I usually read them at weddings that I do unless I find a better song lyric that somebody came up with, and I don't because Paul pins it perfectly. He explains love in maybe the most beautiful way we've ever read it on paper, right? The way he describes it. But when we look at that, it's great for a wife to take this text in 1 Corinthians 13. Let me just flip here and read it for just a second. 1 Corinthians 13, he starts in verse number 4. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends, right? So he writes all that, and there's no better advice you could give to a wife, to be wife or to be husband on their wedding day than to break love down like this. And so it's great to read when uniting two individuals to make one couple. But the reality of that chapter is that Paul's not writing to a husband and to a wife. And he's not actually even writing to a couple at all. When he writes those words down on explaining love and what love is supposed to be and what it's supposed to look like, he's actually writing it to a congregation. He's writing it to a church. He's writing it to a body of believers. He's not writing it to a man and to a woman. He's not writing it to a mother and son. He's writing it to a congregation of people. Here is how you're supposed to love people. All right? So 1 Corinthians, and again, we've covered this. We broke that book down and went through it. But he writes this book, 1 Corinthians, is one of his letters, one of his 4 letters. We have 2 in our Bible. But 1 Corinthians, he wrote to the Corinthian church to identify some stuff that their church wasn't getting right. And there were 2 huge problems that he was addressing. But disorder in their corporate worship. So he spends a lot of time in there talking about things that they're not doing or they need to be doing a better job of, or things that they're doing wrong when it comes to their worship service. And then they were confused on a lot of stuff, some of their beliefs and some of the things that are being taught, having to deal with some false teaching or some of their old law coming into play, where they've spent their whole life living a life that abides by the law, and now all of a sudden you're telling us that we're supposed to be living under grace and Jesus and love and all this stuff, and there's a little bit of confusion there. And they had tons of other stuff going on. They had sexual misconduct going on in the church. And they had some members of the church thought they were spiritually superior to other church members, meaning they thought that they were better than somebody else. They may have came from a long line of Pharisees or religious leaders or whatever, so they thought they were better than these people who just walked in off the street and got saved yesterday. And then they had some members that were suing each other inside the church. All right, so you think you've had a bad run at it at church. These people were actually having lawsuits carried out on them inside their congregation. All right, so it'd be like you getting mad, me getting mad at Wayne, and I'm going to sue Wayne. But we're still going to sit here and have church together. You can't have unity or a fellowship like that, right? So they had all this stuff going on, and they're having all these problems. And so Paul writes this letter to the Corinthian church addressing a lot of these issues, and then even more that we didn't have time to get to. But You can go through there, and I remember as we went through 1 Corinthians, and we went through it during COVID, it was in 2020, it's amazing how many of the problems they were having are the same exact problems we're having in 2023. When it comes to problems we're having in our churches in America, they're dealing with them in Corinth. All right, so he's addressing all these, and he's telling them what he shouldn't be doing, what they should not be doing, what they should be doing a better job of, and then he gets to chapter 13. And chapter 13 is almost on an entirely different level. All right, it goes even beyond what he said in the first 12 chapters. And it reminds me, as I was going through that this week, it reminds me of what we talked about at Man Church on Sunday night. And so Sunday night we were talking about Colossians chapter 3. And if you want to write this down, you can go back and study that this week because this kind of goes along. And actually we're going to refer back to, and I left this off, and you need to write it down anyway, Colossians 3. Paul is telling the Colossians, again, what not to do. Okay, and so he spends chapter 3, verse number 5 through 10, he tells them what not to do, what stuff they need to be getting rid of in their life. All right, so he says this, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you. All right, so verse number 5, he starts naming off things that we need to get out of our life as a follower of Jesus. Sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. All right? So he starts naming all these things that as a Christian, we should have no part of in our life. And these are things that when we look at, we put on a pedestal of stuff that we have kicked out of our life. All right? So we came to know Jesus, and we got rid of this sexual impurity. We got rid of these sexual immorality, impurity, these earthly passions, evil desires. We got rid of our foul mouth. We hung up alcoholism. We stopped this addiction to pornography or whatever it is we struggle with, and we know we shouldn't be doing these things. When we give our life to Jesus, when we stop doing these things that we've been told not to, we kind of celebrate those things, right? Like, we know as a Christian it's not okay to kill people. Don't kill people. Don't lie. Don't steal. Don't cheat. Don't do these things, all right? So these are things that we're expected not to do, but here's the thing. Those things, whether you know Jesus or not, you can obey those. All right? How many of you, well, I'm not going to ask any questions because if somebody raises their hand, we're going to have a lawsuit, and then we're going to be in 1 Corinthians. I'm betting before you got to know Jesus, you probably didn't kill anybody. Again, please don't raise your hand. I don't want to know. But most people do not have a hard time with not murdering somebody, whether they have Jesus or not. All right? Now, there are things that we all struggle with. I understand. But there are things that we can obey. We can be given a list as lost people. And case in point, these religious leaders that have been preaching it their whole life were living by the law, but they did not know Jesus, and therefore they were never saved. Do you understand? Anybody can obey a rule. It's not the obeying the law that gets us into heaven that sets us apart. It's how we exhibit grace. And so Paul, in Colossians 3, verse number 5, he tells us what we shouldn't be doing as believers. And then in verse number 12, he starts to tell us what we should do as believers. And these things are things that we can't do without Jesus. It's what sets us apart. It's what makes us different than anything else in this world, all right? So he tells us in verse number 5, hey, don't be sexually immoral. That's not right. Don't be impure. Don't have passions in this world. Don't have evil desires. Don't covet. And then in verse number 12, he says, put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. All right? None of those things you're going to be able to knock out without Jesus. All right? I can tell you, don't kill somebody. And you can do that with or without Jesus. I can tell you to go be kind to everybody. You can't do that without Jesus. You understand? So he goes to this next level when it comes to being a follower, being a Christian, being someone that follows Jesus. It's not just what not to do. If we want to take it to the next level, if we want to be set apart, it's what we should be doing. All right, so he tells us in chapters 1 through 12 what we shouldn't be doing, right? How to take corporate worship, how to take the Lord's Supper, how to do all these things. And then in verse number 13, he says, look, this is what you should be doing. This is how you should treat other people. This is how you should love one another. This is how you should be getting along. Every single one of you in here, your lawsuits, your sexually impure thoughts, all these things that you've got going on that's corrupting the church, it would all take care of itself if you just did chapter number 13. All right, chapter 13 starts off this way. If I speak in tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Without love for other people, nothing else that you do in this world matters at all. You're just a Pharisee. The Pharisees nailed the law, right? They had it perfected down to a science. They knew exactly how to live by the law, but they could not get chapter 13. Paul names some crazy stuff in here, right? He says, if you speak tongues, then you're just, and you don't have love, you're just a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. In other words, you're just making noise, right? He says if you have prophetic powers, you understand everything, you have all knowledge of everything that's ever happened or that's ever going to happen, and you have faith, so much faith that you can move mountains, but you don't have love, then you're nothing. And then in verse number 3, he goes even further with it, and he says, if you give away everything you have, all right, you have so much faith in Jesus that you go right now and you sell all of your possessions. Not only that, if you give up your life, he says, if I deliver my body to be burned, if you deliver your life as a sacrifice, if you lay your own life down, if you give your own life to martyrdom or whatever, you say, hey, I'm so into Jesus that I'm going to lay my life down, but yet you don't love others, then it was absolutely for nothing. It was a waste. And so he's writing this to this church, right? Because these people were coming to church for the wrong reasons. You were here to love other people, to serve other people. All right? These people in Corinth were having a hard time with this concept, and we as a church, we as the American church, have this same issue because we've been taught our whole life. We've got it so backward. We've been taught our whole life that we're to go and to find a church where we love the preaching and we love the singing, we love the color of their carpet, their kids ministry is exactly how we want it, their youth ministry is exactly how we want it, they cook the right food, they have the right, we start at 11, we're done at 12, we can be in our car at 12:05, right? We've got it all laid out exactly how we want it, and if we can't find a church, and we're never going to find a church that fits us perfectly, so we've been taught to find the one that fits us best. And then when we get plugged in enough and get comfortable, we can start to change some stuff to make it be more how we want it. That's how we look for churches. That's the kind of church that we want. And so what happens when we have that mindset to where we're finding a church that fits me, it slowly turns into everything we do in church is focused on putting myself ahead of others. I don't care what that side of the congregation wants. I want the preacher to do this. I don't care what kind of music that side of the congregation wants. I want the song service to sound like this. And we start to critique things, and we start to change things, and we start to look for things that better serve us. We have turned church into something that serves us. That is not why you are here. Let me rephrase that. That is not why you should be here. If you're here for that reason, you're here for the wrong reason. All right? You're not here to be served. You should be here to serve. Right? You should be at church to serve others. Why? Because you were called to be imitators of Christ. And Christ was the ultimate servant. He didn't come here to be served. He could have, He could have came and demanded that we serve him. He could have came and demanded that we worship him right now. But he came to serve us. He set an example of service from the get-go, and he expects us to do the same exact thing. He was the ultimate servant, so we should follow suit, and we should be, not because we're told to, that goes back to the legalism. That goes back to being a Pharisee. We should serve others because it's inside of us. It's a desire that is burning. We want to see people loved on. We want to see people served. We want to see people changed. That should be what we want out of church. Not to be fed, not to get what we want. If the preacher messed up, so what? He does that every week, right? If the song service wasn't the songs we wanted this week, so what? Sunday morning was another great worship service. We had visitors in the back, and I was watching them. They were raising their hands, and they were praising. I was like, you know what? They've never even been in here. They were loving this, right? We never know what somebody else is. And so we have this mindset that when we get in the car, we're like, I didn't like that. Well, it doesn't matter. What about the other 100 people that were here? What were they feeling? What was God doing in their life? We never know. We should be more concerned with them than we are with ourselves. Thomas Rainer, the guy who wrote this whole study, he's got an organization, I guess it's an organization, called Church Answers. And I follow him on Facebook. And it is this group of, I guess they're pastors. I'm not really sure what they are. But their mission is to support local churches. And local churches that are having a conflict or a difficulty or something will write Rainer, and he'll try to go in and have like an intervention and help them get back on track. And he wrote this in the book. He was talking about all the interventions that he's had to do, and all the churches he's gone and counseled and tried to work through these problems. He says, out of all the years they've been going to these churches that have reached out to them, he says, very rarely, very few times has he ever been contacted because of a theological problem in a church. Very few times has it been over doctrine. He said almost 99% of the time that I'm called to a church, almost 99% of the time that I'm called to go and settle a conflict or put out a disagreement, it always has to do with personal preference not being met. He said it's always about carpet color. They don't like the carpet color. He said it's always about the preaching. They don't like the style of preaching. He said it's always about music. They can't agree on what type of music that they want to listen to. So he said it's always about somebody putting themselves above another group of people and wanting what they want. And he said that's always the conflicts that we're having in church. If we were focused above all else on serving others, on loving others, then none of that stuff would ever come up. We would never have a conflict on church carpet. And I say church carpet because almost all the fights you hear about that are like, hey, we got mad at the church carpet. I mean, it's crazy, right? It's always something like that. But if we're focused on loving people the way that Paul is trying and striving to tell us in 1 Corinthians 13, and then Colossians 3, this is why I want you to write this down. Go back and read this chapter this week. Colossians 3, in verse number 12, when he starts talking about what we should be doing, being compassionate, being kind, being humble, being meek, being patient. Then in verse number 14, he says this, and above all else, above everything else, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. So above everything else you do, nothing else matters if you do not love, because love is what holds us all together, all right? You are called to be a unifying church member. You're not just called to sit here. You're not called just to sit here and serve. You're called to sit here and be a unifying church member to where when you walk in these doors, your job, your goal, your mission, your desire is to love those people that you're about to sit down in a room with. Serve those people that you're about to sit down in a room with. All right? The fastest way you can tear a church apart is go in there and look for what you want and demand to get what you want, right? The only way we can ever come together, like Paul says in Colossians 3:14, is to love. Love everyone else. Love in such a way that you put yourself last, because not only are we called to be imitators of Christ, and by being imitators of Christ, we serve, we love like Christ did, and Christ loved ultimately by being sacrificial. The ultimate way to love something is to sacrifice. And we're called to be sacrificial church members where we put everything we want, all of our desires last, in the back seat. Worry about others first. Foremost, love them. So I want to take a look at two different churches here, and two completely different styles. One church is unified, and one church is Paul's begging to unify, right? So back in Acts chapter 4, we've referred back to this a few times because this is the first time we see the local church, the first time they come together as a body of believers, and we have this word church. Back in Acts 4, things are going great, right? We've just started meeting, we've just started coming together, and in chapter 4, verse number 32, it says, "Now the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own, but they had everything in common." All right? Do you understand what's going on here? There's absolutely no disputes. In fact, if I wanted to go and get in Siobhan's van and drive off, that's fine, because as far as Siobhan's concerned, it's my van. I barely drive mine. I can't drive. I don't know how you drive that bus. Right? We just share the same vehicles, share the same food, share the same money. Again, this isn't socialism. This is living as one body of believers. This is being so in love with one another, so in tune with the Spirit that there's no selfish desires, there's no covetousness, there's no jealousy. There's just a bunch of believers living in unison, living in perfect harmony. Why? Because love brings us and keeps us in harmony. All right? So you have these believers, and they've come together, and they are a completely selfless congregation. All they're concerned about is serving one another. All they want is for tomorrow somebody else that they've never met before to walk through those doors, and they can serve them and love them and help them and give them what they have. That's what their mindset's on, right? They are sacrificing everything they own, everything they want, all of that to make sure that they maintain unity in the church. And if you read in Acts, we've referred to it every week since we've been doing this study, they were multiplying day by day by day. People were flocking to the church. People were flocking to Jesus because there's absolutely no conflict, no backstabbing, no gossip, no jealousy, no coveting, none of that. They're just a group of believers loving Jesus. And because that's the only thing that matters, they're able to get along with one another. But then you have 1 Corinthians 1. And back to Paul, and he's struggling. He is begging this church, right? He says, "I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree, and that there be no divisions among you, and that you be united in the same mind and same judgment." He's saying, look, I'm begging you, please just get along. Please just agree on stuff. Please just stop arguing. He's not telling them, hey, you need to go back to Acts where, in the long scheme of things, this is just a few years earlier. He's not saying, hey, you need to go back and read what was going on in Acts when, they were sharing people's vehicles, they were eating supper together, all that. He said, I just want you to get along with one another. I just want you to stop arguing, disagreeing, suing each other, right? Just get along. And this is the picture of churches in 2023. Just get along. Why does Paul tell them to get along? He says, because, look, you're serving one God. You're coming together for one purpose. You should have one mind. We're all going to be judged by the same God. There's nothing for us to disagree on. There's nothing for us to argue about. Yes, he's not saying you shouldn't have different opinions. You shouldn't like different things. Some of you are going to like the old hymns. Some of you are going to like the new contemporary music. Some of you think we should read out of King James Version. Some of you think we should read out of the NIV. He's not saying any of that. He's just saying none of it matters. Absolutely 0% of that matters, because the only thing that matters is that you are here to serve Jesus. You are here to honor and glorify and praise Jesus. And if you're here, that's all that should matter. We shouldn't have time to focus on this other stuff. We shouldn't have time to sue people. We shouldn't have time for sexual misconduct or these arguing over which law is the greatest law, all this stuff, right? We should only be focused on the one thing that brings us together, and that one thing is Jesus. in order to truly change the way the world views Christianity, then we've got to start changing the way the world sees our church. You know what runs people out of church more than anything else? Church. We do. We do a great job of running people out of church. We do the best job at running people away from church. In fact, Satan probably laughs and sits back smiling a lot of times because he doesn't have to do anything because we just can't get along. We're too worried that that person's got what they want and I don't have what I want. Or that person's doing this. Or that person's sinned differently than I have. Or this person don't need to be here. Or that person didn't do this. Or that person, I always think of Jess Foxworthy, I don't know where, the woman, and she's mad because the woman took her casserole dish. What was that? I think a tornado took that woman away. Never mind. Completely different story. Save that for another time when we preach about tornadoes. But we get hung up on, that's why we shouldn't do casseroles. Then we have to worry about casserole dishes. Right? You get in and got me fired up today. Talking about your taco casseroles. Anyways, if we just focused on what mattered, we wouldn't have to worry about any of this other stuff. But we are not going to be able to go out into the world and portray what a true Christian should be until we start living like true Christians inside the church. There's some churches that, people walk in and all they see is division. They see bickering. They see lawsuits. They see angry individuals because they're not getting what they want. And they see a selfish body of believers. Nobody wants to be a part of that. Right? We've got to become unifying church members to where we are so in love with Christ that we're in love with our fellow church members more than we're in love with ourselves. I'm more concerned with serving this individual or seeing that individual succeed and do well and grow in their walk than I am to hear the style of music that I like or to hear the type of sermons that I like. Right? In order to be a unifying church member, back to Colossians 1:14, we have to put love above all. Because love is what binds us. Love is what keeps us in harmony. Let's pray. Father, we want to thank you tonight for allowing us to just be here in your house, God, and I thank you for each and every individual that's here. I pray that if there's anyone in here this afternoon that they don't know you as their Savior, I pray first and foremost they take care of that. But God, for the rest of us, and we're trying to go out and to identify as a follower of Christ in this world, I pray that we get serious about our faith, and we get serious about being a church member, not for numbers or anything like that, God, but plugged into the body where we are functioning as a functioning member of the body, God, and we're serving others, and we're loving others. We're putting others above ourselves, God, because that's how you want us to live, and that's the best way to imitate you to the rest of this world. God, we love you, and we thank you for all that you're doing. It's in your name I pray.